on the shortcomings and mistakes in the coverage of the history of German philosophy at the end of the 18th and early 19th centuries. In 1943, the Institute of Philosophy of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR published the third volume of the History of Philosophy, edited by comrades G. Alexandrov, B. Bykovsky, M. Mitin, P. Udin. A considerable part of the volume is devoted to the exposition and evaluation of German philosophy of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. In the third volume of the History of Philosophy, serious mistakes are made in the presentation and evaluation of German philosophy. The classics of Marxism-Leninism distinguish in Hegel's philosophy two aspects: the dialectical method and the conservative metaphysical system. If the dialectical method of Hegel contained a rational grain, the doctrine of development, and was the progressive side of Hegel's philosophy, then his idealistic dogmatic system was conservative, demanded the cessation of development, and was in sharp contradiction with the dialectical method. Meanwhile, in chapters 3 of the volume of the History of Philosophy, devoted to the philosophies of Kant, Fichte and Hegel, the authors of the chapters, Comrade Asmus, Bykovsky, Chernyshov, the contradiction between the progressive side of Hegel's philosophy, his dialectical method, and the conservative side, his dogmatic system. Volume 3 does not take into account that Hegel tried to build a complete philosophical system that was supposed to express an absolute truth. Hegel essentially proclaimed the end of history, the end of all development. Mankind, through Hegel's philosophy, comes to know the absolute idea. Criticizing Hegel's desire to present his philosophical system for absolute truth, Engels wrote, but this meant proclaiming the absolute dogmatic content of Hegel's system as absolute truth and thereby becoming in contradiction with his dialectical method, which is corrupting all dogmatic. This meant crushing the revolutionary side under the weight of an overextended conservative side, and not only in the field of philosophical knowledge, but also in relation to historical practice. Mankind, in the person of Hegel, raised to the knowledge of the absolute idea, should also have been left in the practical field so far that it became possible for him to carry the absolute idea into reality. The absolute idea was not to impose too much political demands on his contemporaries. That is why at the end of the philosophy of law, we learn that the absolute idea must be realized in that monarchy, limited by a state representation, which Friedrich Wilhelm III so persistently and so vainly promised his subjects, that is, in a limited and moderate, indirect domination of the property classes, adapted to the then petty bourgeois relations of Germany. In conclusion, the necessity of the nobility is proved there by speculative means. Marx and Engels, Collected Works, Volume XIV, p. 639. The contradiction between the method and the system of Hegel penetrates all his philosophical views. It is clear that in the subsequent period various reactionaries in politics and philosophy clung to the conservative side of Hegel's teachings, to his system, and acted as ardent opponents of Hegel's dialectical method. The revolutionary thinkers used the progressive side of Hegel's philosophy, his dialectical method. Marx and Engels rejected the reactionary system of Hegel's philosophy. At the same time, they retained the progressive that was contained in the dialectical method of Hegel. At the same time, Marx and Engels radically revised Hegel's method, put him on his feet, and thus the idealistic dialectic of Hegel gave way to the materialist dialectic of Marx. My dialectical method, Marx wrote in the afterword to the second edition of Volume I of Capital, is not only fundamentally different from the Hegelian, but is its direct opposite. For Hegel, the process of thinking, which he calls an idea even as an independent subject, is the demiurge, creator of the real, which is only its external manifestation. For me, on the contrary, the ideal is nothing but the material, transplanted into the human head and transformed into it. Consequently, Marx could not simply take Hegel's dialectic, since Hegel's dialectic was inseparably linked with his idealistic philosophical system. In Hegel's philosophy, Idealism and dialectics are merged into one, and the ultimate goal of dialectics is the proof of the truth of objective idealism. Hence it is clear that the materialist dialectic of Marx, by its very nature, is opposed to the idealistic dialectic of Hegel. As we know, Lenin pointed out that Hegel only guessed the dialectic of things in the dialectic of concepts. He guessed right no more. Lenin's Philosophical Notebooks, p. 189, and that Hegel's dialectics had to be isolated from the dung heap of absolute idealism. Lenin, Materialism and Empirio-Criticism. Works of TXIII, p. 199. In his work, on dialectical and historical materialism, Comrade Stalin gave a genuinely scientific assessment of Hegel's dialectic and with complete clarity defined the relation of Marxist dialectics to the dialectic of Hegel. Comrade Stalin said, characterizing their dialectical method, Marx and Engels usually refer to Hegel as a philosopher who formulated the basic features of dialectics. This, however, does not mean that the dialectic of Marx and Engels is identical with Hegel's dialectic. In fact, Marx and Engels took from Hegel's dialectic only its rational grain, rejecting Hegel's idealistic husks and developing dialectics further, in order to give it a modern scientific form. Stalin, Questions of Leninism, p. 535. 11th ed. Meanwhile, the authors of Volume 3 of the History of Philosophy departed from the Marxist-Leninist assessment of the significance of Hegelian dialectics, did not show the limited dialectic of Hegel, did not emphasize its opposition to materialistic dialectics, and in a number of cases the characteristic of Hegel's dialectic almost does not differ from Marxist dialectics. Considering the philosophy of Hegel, the authors of the volume clearly overestimate Hegel's merits in substantiating the historical view on the development of nature and society, in developing the doctrine of the role of practice in the theory of knowledge. In the third volume of the History of Philosophy, Hegel's dialectic is incorrectly portrayed as complete and comprehensive. Thus, for example, on page 216 of the volume states, Hegel's historical significance in the history of philosophy is based on the fact that in his teaching he found his completion and received a comprehensive encyclopedic development of the dialectical method of thinking. It is clear that there is nothing like this in Hegel's philosophy. Hegel did not complete and could not complete the development of the dialectical method already because he was an idealist and a conservative in public views. Moreover, as is known, no social conditions necessary for this, nor the conditions for scientific development, were formed in the life of Hegel to fulfill this task, so that his dialectics could not be either comprehensive or complete. The authors of Volume 3 unreasonably attribute to Hegel the spread of dialectics to social life. On page 218 the authors write, the deepening of the dialectical method, the creation of a new, dialectical, logic was a great historical merit of Hegel. The justification of the universality of dialectics, the extension of the dialectical method not only to nature, but also to social life, the conquest of human history for dialectics is such his other historical merit. It is known that Hegel was unable to conduct a historical view of the development of nature. It is all the more unreasonable to ascribe to Hegel the spread of dialectics to social life. The application of dialectics to the analysis of social life would inevitably lead Hegel to revolutionary conclusions with respect to contemporary German reality, which, as is known, he did not do. Dialectics requires us to consider social life in a change, in development, and every stage of social development that has already been achieved is not as the final result of social progress, but as a necessary and initial point of the subsequent development of society. Meanwhile, Hegel considered the modern state system of Germany the ultimate result of historical development, and the Prussian monarchy the embodiment of absolute spirit. It is also incorrect for the authors of the volume to claim that Hegel created a new theory of the historical process. On page 221 of the volume it says, the world historical significance of the Hegelian phenomenology of the spirit, consists in revealing a new, in-depth notion of history, in approving a new concept of development. On the same page, an incorrect statement is advanced. Hegel deeply comprehended here the essence of history as a natural, unified process, as a dynamic interconnection of events. The authors in this case attributed to Hegel merit, which in reality does not belong to him. In comparison with Montesquieu or Herder, Hegel made a famous step forward in understanding history. However, Hegel's views on history remained within that idealistic understanding of the historical process that was characteristic of the entire preceding sociology. Hegel's views on history cannot now be regarded as completely outdated. In general, the philosophy of history, Lenin writes about Hegel, gives very little. This is understandable, for it is here, precisely in this field in which Marx and Engels made the greatest step forward. Here Hegel is the most outdated and antiquated. Lenin, Philosophical Notebooks, p. 251. The authors of Volume 3 did not take into account that the contrast between the idealistic dialectics of Hegel and the Marxist dialectical method reflects the antithesis of the bourgeois and proletarian worldview. It is known that Hegel's dialectic is turned exclusively to the past. It is applied to the past history of human society, to the history of law, aesthetics, religion and philosophy. In addition, the past Hegel illuminates from a prejudiced, idealistic point of view, from the point of view of the self-development of the absolute spirit. In contrast, the classics of Marxism-Leninism created and substantiated the dialectical materialist understanding of social life, applied dialectics not only to the past, but also to the present and future development of human society. Speaking about the application of the dialectical method to public life, Comrade Stalin writes, "If the world is in continuous movement and development, if the withering away of the old and the growth of the new is the law of development, then it is clear that there are no more unshakable social orders, eternal principles, property and exploitation, the eternal ideas of the subordination of the peasants to the landlords, the workers of the capitalists. Hence, the capitalist system can be replaced by the socialist system, just as the capitalist system replaced the feudal system in its time." Questions of Leninism, p. 540. 11th ed. One of the main features of the Marxist dialectical method in applying to the practical activities of the Bolshevik Party is that in politics one must focus not on those layers of society that do not develop more, although they are presented to the present. The moment is the prevailing force, and the layers that develop have a future, although they do not represent the prevailing force at the moment. That means, says Comrade Stalin, in order not to make a mistake in politics, we must look ahead, not backward. In the third volume, The Philosophy of Kant, Fichte, Hegel is portrayed primarily as progressive, in view of which their conservative philosophical system is obscured. The classics of Marxism-Leninism sharply criticized the conservative political views of German philosophers and emphasized the prevalence of the conservative side in their outlook. Engels, for example, wrote about Hegel. Hegel himself, in spite of the explosions of revolutionary wrath that was not rare in his writings, generally inclined mainly to the conservative side. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach, Works of Marx and Engels, TXIV, p. 641. Marx and Engels wrote about the Hegelian philosophy of law. Having looked a little closer, we discover that here, as in many other cases, German idealism merely sanctifies the laws of the existing society and throws a supersensual cover on them. Marx and Engels, The Death Penalty, Collected Works, Volume IX, p. 88. The third volume of the History of Philosophy does not take into account these indications of Marx and Engels. Such reactionary social and political ideas of German philosophy as the praise of the Prussian monarchical state, the exaltation of the Germans as an elected people, the disdainful treatment of the Slavic peoples, the apologetics of war, the justification of the colonial and predatory policies, etc. Thus, The fact that the ideologists of the German imperialist bourgeoisie is using the reactionary aspects of Kant's philosophy, Fichte and Hegel. For example, in the third volume of the History of Philosophy, the following reactionary arguments of Hegel about the war from his philosophy of law are completely bypassed. Hegel writes, "The high significance of the war is that thanks to it, as I expressed it elsewhere, the moral health of peoples, its indifference to the stagnation of finite determinateness, remains, just as the movement of the winds does not allow the lake to decay, which would inevitably happen with prolonged calm, so the war protects peoples from decay, which certainly would be the result of a prolonged, and even more so, eternal peace." Hegel writes further that successful wars did not allow the development of internal turmoil and strengthened state power. In peacetime, civil life expands, all spheres are settled for permanent residence, and, after all, people are sucked up by the swamp, their particular characteristics are increasingly consolidated and stiffen. From the war, the nations, not only come out fortified, and nations within which there are irreconcilable antagonisms, gain inner peace through external wars. War, however, brings with it the insecurity of property, but this real insecurity is nothing more than the necessary movement. Wars arise where they are caused by the nature of things. Crops again give shoots, and empty chatter stops before serious repetitions of history. Philosophy of Law, p. 344-345. From the quotation cited, it is evident that Hegel expresses himself in the most definite way for the necessity of wars. He acts in this case as a preacher, an apologist for war. In Volume 3, Hegel's reactionary reasoning is ignored, glorifying the German people as an elected people, called upon to rule over other nations. Speaking about the progressive procession of the developing self-consciousness of the world spirit, Hegel draws a general conclusion that in the world history for a given epoch one people becomes the dominant people, which can constitute an epoch. In the face of this absolute right to be the bearer of the stage of development of the world spirit, the spirits of other peoples are deprived of rights, and they, as well as those whose epoch has passed, do not go further into the account of world history. IBID, p. 356. The authors give this reasoning to Hegel, but they do not explain that all this was required by Hegel to justify selectivity and the special role of the German people in history. Hegel in his writings held a view of German nationalism and the purely Prussian principle of the rule of the German people over other peoples. The authors of Volume 3 overlook Hegel's thesis on the need for systematic colonization of other peoples. Hegel wrote in the Philosophy of Law that civil society sees itself forced to found colonies. Already, one growth in the population itself affects it in this direction, but, in particular, the fact that a part of the population cannot satisfy its needs by labor if production exceeds the need for consumption is important. p. 257. Hegel's reactionary arguments about the Slavic peoples are also not criticized in the volume. Hegel wrote in his Philosophy of History, "In Eastern Europe we find a huge Slavic nation that lived in the west along the Elbe to the Danube. However, all this mass is excluded from our review because it has not yet acted as an independent moment in the series The Discoveries of the Mind in the World." p. 330. The authors of Volume 3 did not show the reactionary meaning of Hegel's statements, which exaggerate the Prussian state. In the Philosophy of Law, Hegel pursues the idea that the state is an earthly being. Hegel writes that the existence of the state, this is the procession of God in the world. Its basis is the power of the mind, exercising itself as will. When thinking about the state, one should keep in mind not special states, special institutions, but rather an idea in itself, this real God. p. 268-269. The highest type of state Hegel considers a constitutional monarchy. He writes, "The development of the state in a constitutional monarchy is the work of a new world in which the substantial idea has acquired an infinite form." p. 296. And further, When considering the organization of the state, that is, when considering the constitutional monarchy, one should not take into consideration anything other than the need for an idea within itself. All other points of view must disappear. The state should be regarded as a great architectonic building, like the hieroglyph of reason, which embodies itself in reality. p. 306. Strongly defending the reactionary type of state, Hegel emphasizes the divine sovereignty of the monarch and the injustice of the people. In the philosophy of law, Hegel writes that the people are nothing but a formless mass whose actions are spontaneous, irrational, savage and terrible. p. 328. Volume 3 does not correctly state the political views of Fichte. On page 165 it says, Fichte's nationalism is primarily a form of his democracy, that is, the form in which Fichte's conviction was based on the people's right to freely determine the basic principles of their political life. Meanwhile, Fichte wrote in one of his speeches to the German nation, only the German, as a person of the original, who is not frozen in certain forms, truly has his own people. The foreigner does not have it. Therefore, only a German can have a love for his people, a love for his homeland in the true sense of the word. Or else, if a German does not save the modern culture of mankind, it is unlikely that it will save another European nation. From what has been said, it is clear that Fichte was not a Democrat, but was a Prussian nationalist. Thus, in chapters 3 of the volume of the History of Philosophy, devoted to the philosophy of Kant, Fichte and Hegel, an erroneous exposition of the history of German philosophy is given, exaggerating its significance, lubricating the contradiction between the system and the method of Hegel's philosophy, which brings confusion to the reader's minds. In the volume, the reactionary social and political views of the German philosophers of the late 18th and early 19th centuries were not criticized.